Here, read this.
Woof.
Hello everybody, Ash here from the Read This podcast. Today I am going to be rejudging the 1970 Booker Prize. A few months and many pies ago, I did a video on the 1969 Booker Prize, which was the inaugural, the first one. And I finally got round to reading and writing some quick notes on the shortlist for the 1970 version, which was the second. So I'm going to go through them, give you a little quick review of each one, and then announce my winner. Obviously, these books have been judged once. They were judged by Rebecca West, Richard Hoggart, Antonia Fraser, Ross Higgins, and David Holloway. But now they face a real challenge, some guy with a podcast. Just before we get into it, here's a little snippet from Antonia Fraser on the 1970 prize. She said that the judging of the 1970 prize was a low-key affair, except for the feisty behaviour of Dame Rebecca West, a judge for the second year running. At one point, she denounced Margaret Drabble for her novels of domestic life on the grounds that anyone can do the washing up. Just get a big bowl and some liquid. Why complain about it? The novel in question was The Waterfall, which both Richard Hoggart and I admired greatly and didn't think it was about washing up. In the end, we were split between William Trevor's Mrs. Ekdorf in ONeills Hotel and Bernice Rubens, the elected member. I voted for Rubens, but today would vote for Trevor. Right, well, we'll start with the winner, The Elected Member by Bernice Rubens. This is the story of Norman Zweck, a once promising Jewish lawyer who is now living with his father and sister. He's addicted to drugs and he is hallucinating silverfish when we first see him. After this superficially Kafkaesque start, we soon descend into a kind of parade of misery. We've got aging, bitterness, cancer, waste, kind of incest as well, addiction, none of which are so much talked about as waved about. I thought this was terrible. I'm really not trying to be contrarian by saying the winner was awful, but I really thought it had no redeeming qualities at all. I thought it was an awful book. It's not that I think miserable books need to give an explanation for misery or, God forbid, include light relief. I think more if the futility of life reaches your novel completely unscathed and unchanged and uncommented upon, then you haven't really done much work as a novelist. To make a YouTube analogy, if I owned the rights to despair, I would copy strike this novel for not being transformative content. It's one of those novels that feels as if it rates itself and its subject matter too highly to even bother with language. And I was amazed to see reviews of this book describe it as either a tragicomedy or some kind of dark comedy. There is nothing funny in this book at all. It has this one surreal image to begin with of silverfish, which it keeps returning to as if it's the wackiest idea imaginable, instead of knockoff Kafka. And there are these ongoing riffs about Jewish grammar and syntax, which are so stale and stereotyped that they're exactly the kind of thing I've seen in novels where non-Jewish authors have been criticised for being cliched and borderline racist in their portrayals of Jewish characters. So yeah, in conclusion, I really don't have anything good to say about The Elected Member. I have no idea why it won. So, did I miss something with The Elected Member? Am I way off base? I don't often dislike books as much as I disliked that, and I don't like writing off authors as well. So if you think, yeah, that one's not good, but you should try this book by Bernice Rubens, let me know in the comments below, because, yeah. We move on to The Conjunction by Terence Wheeler. Now, I read most of these as ebooks, but I had a uniquely difficult time getting my hands on a copy of The Conjunction. It is emphatically out of print. There is no ebook version, and the hard copy I could find was going to cost me over $1,000. Luckily, I managed to find a library copy. Here's some exciting action shots of me with it before it had to go back. And on the whole, I'm glad I didn't break the bank. It's not as bad as The Elected Member, but it's a fairly workmanlike historical novel set in Jalawat in rural India during the 60s in the build-up to a conflict with the Chinese. The story follows an Hitler-idolizing principal of a college as he fights against his younger colleagues. There were promising moments. The book sort of flirts with ideas of what we would now call cultural appropriation, and the bits I found most compelling was when Wheeler described the racial self-hatred of his Indian characters. Their obsession with sin and deformity and cosmic superstitions about divine punishment, not dissimilar from some of the material we've covered on Shakespeare's history plays. But that's also where the novel gets a bit iffy. The Indians are by far the most vivid characters because they are the most corrupt and disgustingly behaved, while the only characters who get favourably represented are noticeably Western. Contrary to its name, the whole book did feel very disjointed. The literary and historical elements seemed to clash more often than they cohered. One minute I felt like I was reading an extended Book of Job metaphor, and the next you've got several pages of news articles, and all of those illusions fall away. I did like some of the descriptions of rural Indian life, but without knowing much about this period in history, I'm not entirely sure if I didn't connect with it because of that or because it just wasn't a very stellar book. It's definitely the black sheep on the list. There's sort of a theme running through the rest of them, and whereas this one is a bit of an oddity. Next up, we have Mrs. Ekdorf in O'Neill's Hotel by William Trevor. Here we have the first rendition of one particular theme in this year's competition, which is eccentric female characters at the centre of things. This is the story of Mrs. Ekdorf, a photographer who visits the O'Neill's Hotel in Dublin after becoming intrigued in its tragic history. The hotel is owned by Mrs. Sinnott, a kind of Sybil-like figure who is blind and deaf and approaching her 92nd birthday. Her hotel has fallen into disrepute, mismanaged by her drunkard of a son called Eugene and used by a pimp called Morrissey as the site of his clients' trysts. Mrs. Ekdorf unveils herself in all of these characters' lives, taking pictures whilst following a sort of grail quest. She's trying to capture with her images a life and a history that can't be captured. There is a lot of talk about the truth of art versus the truth of God. The stuff I found most interesting was Trevor discussing the skillful but misleading art of photography and film as well. It's a bit of a dated conversation. There are references to the patron saint of television, for example. But much as that's my kind of theme, it felt a bit wasted in a book that, again, doesn't do much in terms of interesting language. Trevor's style is very visual anyway, so his criticisms of photography didn't really feel like they met much of a response from the literary side of things. I was left thinking, why isn't this a coffee table book of photographs instead of a novel? I don't like to criticize a book by just negatively comparing it to others, but I couldn't banish the thought that this was a little bit of watered-down Joyce, a little bit of watered-down Flann O'Brien, a bit of watered-down J.P. Donlevy maybe, and a lot of watered-down Muriel Spark, particularly in Trevor's main character, Mrs. Ekdorf. Spark is absolutely brilliant at writing true eccentrics. Her central characters in the driver's seat and the public image are impressively, subversively, and consistently eccentric. And maybe this comes down to your taste in eccentrics. I would define a genuine eccentric as a kind of Don Quixote figure, someone who fundamentally roots their lives in a belief system that to the rest of us is demonstrably and occasionally comically false. The other kind of eccentric is the little parochial local dafty who is a bit of a character and usually is self-described as an eccentric. And it's that category that I'd put Mrs. Ekdorf in. Genuine eccentrics don't run around saying, I reject reality. They already have. And what impresses you about them is just how far down the road they've gone. So no, I wouldn't really recommend this. Read Joyce, read Flann O'Brien, read Muriel Spark. I suppose if you run out of Dublin literature, you could give it a whirl, but I found it a little bit weak sauce, to be honest. But no more negativity. The rest of the three are all strong recommends. First up, we have John Brown's Body by A.L. Barker. I enjoyed this a lot. Finally, some good writing. It actually suffers from how good an opening it has, I think. Here's just a short bit of our main character, Maurice, taking in her new lodgings. She could not open her mouth without tasting the tall rooms and the plaster cornices and the sway-backed couch, which smelt like a lion. Love that. This is the story of Maurice and her husband. Maurice is in some ways quite infantile. She hates sex, likes to remain indoors with her toy bear, yet she often does the last thing she expects. Her husband, Jack Tommelty, suggests to her that their new neighbour, Ralph Schilling, is in fact a murderer called John Brown, leading Maurice to fantasise that Ralph is this murderer, something she finds simultaneously alarming and exciting. Schilling responds to his new neighbour's fascination with him with fantasies of his own. He wants to run away with Maurice and leave his life behind him. It's a book told through people's private fantasies. The title references a folk song about the hanging of a 19th century abolitionist called John Brown. The refrain of it goes, "John Brown's body lies a mouldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on." Rebecca West called herself a fanatical admirer of A.L. Barker and said, if you do not admire one of her other books, The Middling, you should ask your vet to put you down. I really enjoyed this. It definitely made me want to read more Barker. I've only read this and a few short stories, so on West's Pain of Death recommendation, I'm going to begin with The Middling. I really recommend it on the strength of its writing. If you like stuff like this, the cat had finished its meal and looked at Ralph with an unanalysable stare, baleful and triumphant. Then it's well worth finding yourself a copy. Much as I liked it, it did never quite live up to its electric beginning, in my opinion, and so it falls just slightly short of the next two, which for me are front runners. So first of all, we have Brunos Dream by the writer who makes the Booker shortlist her stomping ground, Iris Murdoch. Like Mrs. Sinnott in William Trevor's book, Bruno is another 90-year-old head of a family on the edge of death. Again, we are dealing with the subject of living through fantasies and dreams. When I did my 1969 video, I talked about Murdoch's previous novel, The Nice and the Good. And Bruno's Dream similarly has a large cast of characters, lots of couplings and mirrorings, and a sense of Shakespearean exuberance, and Shakespearean order as well, not only in the groupings of characters, but in the patriarchal, slightly Prospero-like figure of Bruno, dreaming up plans of reconciliation and transformation for everybody else. The characters are fixated on living fully. That sounds a bit banal, but I mean understanding the precise quality of experiences and being up to the task of them. One character describes how nothing in philosophy could prepare them for an encounter with death. And Danby, Bruno's son-in-law, says, Danby was aware that one forgot things, but on the whole, he felt that the god must have found him, for all the frenzy of his enthusiasm, something of a disappointment. He had loved wholeheartedly, but with too ordinary a heart. A bit like the last novel, we have reflections on the strange marriage between the doomed animal mind and the spirit, which Murdoch is very prescient and funny about, but also at times in this novel, she writes about it with a kind of body horror sort of way. We've got references to ectoplasm and space eggs, giving the book some flights of science fiction. Those flights are trying to get at abstract textures. Murdoch's characters enact and perform the rites of love and relationships. But what do those rituals count for in the face of death? How can they be measured, and what meaningful resistance do they offer? If, as the book says, all gods are private gods, what sort of comfort can they bring us at the end? Again, I strongly recommend Bruno's Dream, as I'd recommend most, if not all, books by Iris Murdoch. I'm once again going to award her second place, though. It's partly because I can't help judging her by her own high standards, and I think this is not quite top-tier Murdoch, and simply the next book I'm going to talk about, I love too much not to give it first place. But that doesn't mean I don't implore you to read this, if what I've just briefly described sounds good. Finally then, we come to Eva Trout by Elizabeth Bowen. Subtitled Changing Scenes, this is the story of the eponymous Eva, who struggles to organise her life when she inherits her late father's money. Once again, we have a couple of themes that have been running through this competition, an eccentric central female and inheritance as well, which has also cropped up in a few of these books. I absolutely love this book. It's beautifully, cleverly written. Like William Trevor, it is preoccupied with the theme of images. Eva respects and trusts images and makes an effort to keep people in her life as portraits only. This isn't because she's a silly person or a superficial person, but because through images she makes sense of the world. Time, we hear in Eva's mind, lay about like various pieces of a fragmented picture. To reassemble the picture was impossible. Too many of the pieces were lost, lacking. Yet some of the pieces there were would group into patterns. Unlike Trevor, Bowen reflects her theme in her language and pits the two art forms against each other. Right at the beginning of the novel, Eva looks across at the castle. Mirrored into the sheet of probably artificial water, did not look ancient, nor did it look indigenous. Though its setting was English, the pile resembled some Bavarian fantasy. Above the turreted roofline rose steep woods, sepia with winter. Sepia with winter, I just love that. The language is just playfully tinged here and there with photography terms. Bowen recognises language has its own tyranny and demonstrates how misleading and manipulative some characters are in their speech, while the narration too has these ornate spiral staircases of sentences that are picturesque but also tortured and occasionally nonsensical. One character says she is soiled by living more than 1,000 lives. I have lived through books, I have lived internally. By contrast, as the scenes change around her, Eva is monolithic. Her attitude is somehow not the attitude of a thinking person, and she has the conversational style of cement. Eva seeks a kind of permanence, but finds that when permanence is applied to someone living, the effect is creepy and vampiric. One cannot so much look youthful as lack age. As time goes by, a frightening deficiency. Most of all, about this ever-freshness of Constantine's, what had it fed on? Lifeblood? And his guard of blankness, there lurked somewhere youth's most dreadful residuum, youthful cruelty. It's such a rich book, and there are complex literary allusions, funny ones as well. There is a character called Elsinore, a reference to the castle in Hamlet. Just as much as that first landscape is sort of drunk in photography terms and terms that make it feel like a facade. Other characters are drenched in literature and struggling to exist and function as real people. Can't recommend this highly enough. I utterly love this book, and I have to give it the first place because of just how much page-for-page pleasure it gave me compared to the others. If you like lines like, "He wiped the knife of his mind as though after a sacrifice," then this is the book for you. But that brings us to the end of this 1970 Booker Prize roundup. What did I get wrong? Have I made some terrible blunders here? Have I overpraised some books? Have I been unfairly harsh on others? Let me know in the comments below. Let me know if I persuaded you to read any of these. I'd be really interested if you've heard something that might float your boat. And I will see you next time. I will be working on the 1971 edition, but there'll be other videos between now and then. All right, thank you. Take care, everybody, and happy reading.